Matilda had fully embraced her role as the Empress of the Holy Roman Empire. She enthusiastically acclimated to the German court, dutifully earning the moniker Matilda the Good. However, her husband's sudden death due to illness had left her up a creek without a paddle. Though she would have remained informed about events in her homeland in England, she was unable to return. She certainly would have been made aware of the shocking death of her younger brother in 1120. Unfortunately, her long-planned visit in 1122 was scuttled due to fears that King Louis of France would attempt to waylay her party, as his territory physically separated England and Germany. Evidently, curing his wife's homesickness wasn't a risk that the Holy Roman Emperor was willing to take. The years following the White Ship disaster were exceptionally unkind to Matilda's father, King Henry I. He immediately remarried in a desperate attempt to sire a male heir. Additionally, he collaborated with his German son-in-law to invade France. But the assault was deemed too difficult after Louis's people shockingly rallied behind the man they dubbed Louis the Fat. His son's death at sea had resulted in the Duke of Anjou switching allegiances, arranging a marriage between his second daughter and William Clito, the child of William the Conqueror's oldest living son. Henry's chief rival was gaining supporters while he was hemorrhaging them. Instead of rushing headfirst into danger, the 56-year-old sovereign sought a political solution, successfully convincing the Pope that the nuptials were invalid due to the young couple's close familiar relations. Next, Anjou, bordering Normandy to the south, rose up once again in favor of William Clito, forcing Henry to brave a channel crossing to subdue the original seat of the Norman kingdom. The king was still in Normandy when he learned that his daughter's husband had departed from this mortal plane. Suddenly, a new option emerged for the king who lacked an heir. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon Matilda of England. Episode number 3, Heir to the Throne. Although she had other options, none were as appealing to Matilda as a return to the land of her birth. She had departed as a wide-eyed 8-year-old girl, a tool of her family. She returned as an empress, but still lacked agency. Historian Catherine Hanley notes that it was her bloodline rather than her competence that initially moved her to the head of the queue. Certainly, she would have never been recalled to England if either her brother or husband had survived. To Matilda, it must have seemed as though destiny was choosing her for the moment. While some historians, such as Elizabeth Norton, wonder aloud whether Matilda was promised the throne as an enticement to return, there is no definitive evidence that she returned with any expectations, spoken or otherwise, to be England's first ruling queen. The task ahead of her was daunting. Having been gone for so long, she would have had to have entirely relearned Norman French, which remained the lingua franca of England's royal court. Etiquette would have also been a huge adjustment for the princess, who had grown accustomed to a stiff German court that deferred to her as their empress. This wouldn't have been an easy adjustment for Matilda, whom all scholars portray as headstrong and combative. Hanley notes that given the combination of culture shock and linguistic issues, it is probably not surprising that Matilda did not immediately slot back into her allotted place as the king's submissive daughter. Her new stepmother, Queen Adeliza, welcomed her with open arms. The two got on quite well, although scholars are not sure if that was because or despite the fact that her stepmother was 1 year younger than her. She quickly reconnected with her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, a man who would become her greatest champion. She would also have been reunited during this time with her cousins, Theobald and Stephen of Blois, the latter of which would become her greatest enemy. However, after her brother's tragic accident aboard the White Ship, a significant portion of the court she had known as a child was noticeably absent. A year after her return, Henry set about formalizing Matilda as his heir. Such a move came only after the king had dutifully sized up his daughter's fitness. It also likely signaled that he feared that he was past his child-producing years. He didn't just wake up one day and announce his decision to the court, instead cleverly laying breadcrumbs that would help England accept their first female ruler. Legally, Henry argued that Matilda was born to the purple. Primogeniture was one school of thought for royal succession. It argued that the firstborn, son ideally, but in this case surviving daughter, that was born to a ruling king would succeed them. Henry's older brother favored the school of primogeniture, which allowed for the firstborn son to inherit all of their father's lands and power. Robert, as the oldest sibling, would have thus inherited the throne of William, but he had been born before the Norman invasion of 1066. Henry, the youngest of the conqueror's sons, had been born after obtaining the crown of England. He was thus born to the purple, and claimed that his rule was legitimate under his school of thought. Choosing his heir from amongst his direct bloodline therefore helped to retroactively shore up his own legitimacy. He next attempted to persuade his barons to accept his daughter, laying out the case in a long speech given to his captive court. The end result was a public swearing of oaths to accept Matilda as their sovereign. There were a couple of caveats to this, however. First of which was that Henry wasn't simultaneously stepping down as ruler. Doing so would have likely enabled Matilda to establish her rule without trouble, preventing the costly civil war that was to come. Instead, King Henry had made the assembled lords swear that they would accept Matilda as their sovereign if Henry should die without a legitimate male heir. He hadn't yet completely given up hope of impregnating his young wife. Secondly, he made the assembled court pledge their loyalty publicly and individually, utilizing a roll call to make sure that no one could claim that they had stayed silent while everyone else had spoken their oaths. Among those present at the oathing ceremony were Robert of Gloucester, the king's bastard son, and Stephen of Blois, the king's nephew. Public votes like this are a staple of modern-day politics, often used to compel opponents to publicly declare their stance. In 2003, the roll call vote was continually employed to determine the Republican Party's selection for the Speaker of the House. Kevin McCarthy, who later would earn the distinction of being the only speaker in history to ever be recalled, won the speakership after 15 consecutive votes. He and his allies believed they had secured enough votes prior to the 14th attempt, but were surprised when the grand old party's Matt Gaetz announced he was voting nay. A tense atmosphere ensued, almost erupting into a fistfight on the House floor, with few colleagues willing to defend the far-right congressman. Representative Dusty Johnson, a fellow Republican, told the press, "There aren't a lot of people who are gonna go out of their way to defend Matt Gaetz. I mean, he's a pretty diabolical character." After all, Gaetz was accused of sex trafficking a 17-year-old minor. However, one of the most memorable uses of the roll call vote in American politics occurred in 2011. At the time, the Democrats were in charge of the House of Representatives, and the out-of-power Republicans had embraced a group of fiscal conservatives known as the Tea Party, a group that would first morph into the Freedom Caucus before transforming into the congressional wing of the far-right MAGA movement. The Tea Party had begged their Republican colleagues for an extremely draconian budget, one that would scale back the government to its bare bones. Knowing that the Democrats would never pass the proposal, the Republican Party put it on the floor and voted for it with the intention of telling their constituents and their Tea Party allies that they had tried, but the Democrats had once again thwarted them. It was amid this 15-minute vote that the shenanigans started, as the Democrats, who had initially all risen to vote no, began to suddenly switch their votes to present, an option that politicians who don't want to show their hand use to signify that they were at least in the building for the vote. The Democrats' shift in posture meant that the Republican yes votes would be enough to pass the craziest budget in governmental history. Recognizing this, the mainstream Republicans jumped out of their seats and rushed back to change their yes votes to no, successfully voting down their own budget proposal. The gimmick had worked to show where the Republicans really stood on the issue. Similarly, King Henry was coercing every noble assembled into showing their allegiance. No one would have risked going against the aging monarch. After all, Henry was still holding his elderly brother in a cell. To be sure, the court wasn't unified in its desire to seat their first female ruler. The church still held widely chauvinistic views, while others would have been looking out for their own best interests, with a few of those assembled even hoping that the king might name them as his heir. There were instances of female rule in England, but they were typically temporary. For example, a mother might rule until her son reaches a suitable age, or a wife might rule in her husband's place while he is away. Matilda had experienced this when Emperor Henry had left her in charge of their Italian lands. With the official designation as heir to the English throne, all thoughts quickly turned towards who Matilda's husband would be. Despite being 25 years old, an empress, and the heir to the English throne, she would have little say in who her next husband was. While language could designate who was officially in charge, many assumed that her husband would be the one pulling the strings. After all, Christian doctrine at the time literally required the wife to be obedient to her husband. The king chose a 13-year-old boy for the task of overseeing the affairs of his adult daughter. Handley states that, as he turned over the options in his mind, he could not help but return to the question of the all-important alliance with Anjou. So far, he had both lost and gained in that respect. His son's marriage to Count Fulk's elder daughter had ended before it could usefully begin. But he had succeeded in blocking his nephew's marriage to Fulk's younger daughter by having it annulled. Henry had no more sons, and Fulk no more daughters. But the alliance could still be reforged in a slightly different way. An agreement was reached that Matilda would marry Joffrey, Fulk's elder son and heir. There was never going to be a candidate who was perfect in the eyes of all of Henry's barons. But there could surely be little objection, not in the king's hearing anyway, to an alliance that would secure the southern borders of Normandy. There was a single dissenting voice, and it belonged to the bride. Norton writes that Matilda was furious when she heard the news of the match her father had arranged for her. This is hardly surprising, for at 25, Matilda was a mature woman, already widowed, and had been the wife of an emperor. She continued to use her title of empress until the end of her life, and it was something of which she was justifiably proud. Matilda probably felt humiliated by the news that not only was she to marry a child, but the son of a mere count. The historian continues, stating that events surrounding Matilda's second marriage give us the first hint of her fiery character. According to reports, she argued and fought against her father when she was informed, finally being locked in her room by her father until she gave in to his demands. This must have been deeply humiliating for Matilda, who took out her inevitable resentment on her young husband, rather than her more intimidating father. Her best course of action might have been to appeal to the Pope on the basis that she was just as closely related to Joffrey as William Clito had been to Joffrey's sister. However, ultimately, she accepted the match, on paper at least, putting her ambition for the throne ahead of her own personal desires. It is at this moment that her cousin, William Clito, re-emerged as a leading character in Matilda's story. Clito was the son of Robert, the Conqueror's eldest child. In most parallel universes, he would be the heir to his father, rather than the son of a convict. France's King Louis had held out hope that Clito might become the heir, and had thus held that boy back from his lifelong quest to see his father freed. With the path to the throne finally cut off, Louis unleashed the young man. Chronicler Henry of Huntingdon is among those who paint a picture of William Clito as the ideal image of a king, writing that William made up for the small size of his forces by his inextinguishable prowess. All his armor stained with enemy blood, he hacked into the enemy squadrons with his lightning sword. The enemy could not withstand the awesome weight of his youthful arm and took flight in terror. He was of royal blood, extremely popular with his men, and most importantly, in comparison to Matilda, he was a man. Louis formally recognized him as the Count of Flanders, a territory historically threatening Normandy's eastern border. Matilda wouldn't even be allowed to have influence over the coming war. Those tasks would be reserved for her elderly father and teenage husband. Once again, she found herself reduced to a powerless female at the mercy of male relatives. Meanwhile, her father-in-law stepped down as the Count of Anjou in favor of his son, who was already known as Joffrey le Bel, or Joffrey the Handsome. The boy's father was off to the Middle East to marry the Queen of Jerusalem, one of the world's few ruling women of the time. To further enhance the boy's suitability, the king knighted him before the wedding, which resulted in Empress Matilda being transformed into Countess Matilda, a woman who, according to the law, was now the property of her teenage husband. King Henry and his nephew Stephen took the fight to William Clito, proving that experience often trumps bravery. They severed his economic trade routes and worked to destabilize Flanders from within. Henry personally led the armies in the field, regularly forcing the younger William Clito to retreat deep into French territory. When Henry's armies were within 8 days' march of Paris, Louis withdrew much of his support and abandoned his protege. Despite this, Clito continued to fight, eventually receiving a wound to his hand that became infected. Medicine during the 12th century was rarely up to the task. Although breakthroughs were on their way as medical schools began to emerge throughout southern Europe, and in 1140 Roger of Sicily forbade anyone from practicing medicine without a license, creating the first official regulation for doctors. However, these practices tended to originate in southern Europe, areas with a mix of Christians, Jews, and Arabs. England often lagged behind in receiving cutting-edge medical breakthroughs. While William Clito might have had a healer among his forces, it is just as likely that he would have gone to a barber to be bled or even leeched. Unfortunately, whatever care he received did not work, as his whole arm up to the shoulder turned as black as coal. 5 days after receiving the wound to his hand, he perished in July of 1128. Although she had been named as the heir, the removal of her cousin from the board must have given her some relief. This, coupled with the fact that her father continued to run the kingdom, allowed her to focus on her marriage. Unfortunately, it seemed doomed from the beginning. Joffrey assumed that his marriage would make him heir to the kingdom, but Henry's actions revealed that he never intended for the handsome boy to wield power over his wife. While he continued to list Matilda on the charters that he signed, he never made mention of her husband. Chronicler Orderic Vitalis interprets this as Joffrey's role being intended solely as a battle commander who would sally out on his wife's behalf, someone to handle the martial aspects of the crown while she safely ran the kingdom from her throne. Within a year of marriage, Matilda fled her husband's household in Anjou for the safety and security of her father's home in London. She would have been well aware of the whispers that pointed out that she had yet to produce a single pregnancy, despite being married twice. Norton speculates that it seems likely that after a year of childless and stormy marriage, both were hoping for a divorce, and Matilda must have entreated her father to help end her unendurable marriage. Henry, who had forced the marriage upon his daughter in the first place, was at a loss as to what to do with his determined daughter and allowed her to stay with him for the next 2 years. To his credit, Joffrey gave his wife the space she needed, using the time to develop his military skills against numerous rebel factions in his land. In 1130, he fathered an illegitimate child, which likely intensified the whispers about Matilda's fertility. Both of her husbands had managed to sire illegitimate children, while failing to conceive with her, turning the whispers into resounding accusations. The Pope's arrival in Rouen compelled Henry and Matilda to brave a rough channel crossing, during which the king publicly promised not to collect a tax for 7 years, if God saw them safely to the other side. Instead of receiving the Pope's blessing to annul the marriage, Henry forced his daughter to return to her husband's home, while publicly reaffirming her status as his heir. The subtext about her infertility would have been evident to all those assembled. A year later, Matilda became pregnant and successfully carried the baby to term. At the age of 31, she gave birth to her son, whom she named Henry after her father. Hanley informs us that the boy's birth wiped out the humiliation of her having been considered barren, of not having borne the emperor a son, and has strengthened her position as her father's heir. She wept for joy at the boy's baptism, the only time she is ever reported as shedding tears in public, and Henry would be her favorite child all her life. The feeling was mutual, as the newborn would don her last name, the final remnant of her time as the Empress of the Holy Roman Empire. Until the day he died, Henry was known as Henry Fitz-Empress. A second pregnancy came in 1134, the same year that her imprisoned uncle finally passed away. Her father's designation, the lack of other contenders with royal blood, and the fact that she had already produced a son to succeed her meant that Matilda's position had never been stronger. The biggest threat to her future rule would be if her father were to survive for another 15 years, allowing him to appoint his grandson and namesake as heir rather than the boy's mother. However, her second pregnancy didn't go as smoothly as the first. Aware of the risks and considering that 13% of women died during childbirth, she had a well-documented argument with her father over where she wished to be buried. Fortunately, she managed to pull through and gave birth to Joffrey, a boy named after his father. His success at producing both an heir and a spare ought to have firmly solidified Matilda's husband's place in the family, but Hanley reveals to us that Joffrey of Anjou, also known as Joffrey Plantagenet from his habit of wearing a sprig of bloom, planta genista in Latin, was no longer the boy Matilda had married. He was now in his early 20s, a father, the holder of extensive lands, and a man with years of experience as count and military leader under his belt. King Henry's refusal to associate him with any real royal or ducal power continued, and by this point Joffrey may well have been coming to the realization that he was never going to be King of England. It was during this interim period that the young man seems to have become obsessed with Normandy, the territory to the north of his own. An argument erupted between Joffrey and his liege/father-in-law in 1134 over 3 Norman castles that the young count believed had been promised to him as part of Matilda's dowry. King Henry felt that elevating Joffrey out of obscurity to reign beside his daughter had been more than generous. The verbal altercation left Matilda torn between her husband and her father, and for once she chose to side with Joffrey. Shortly after, she became pregnant for a 3rd time. Given her recent near-death experience, she was placed on bed rest for her own health and the well-being of her baby. The pregnancy would prove to be extremely costly for Matilda, sidelining her at precisely the wrong time. It was just another disadvantage of being female in the political world. Gender continues to represent a significant political handicap in the modern day. A 1996 article in Parliamentary Affairs reports that female politicians feel tremendous pressure to be perfectly groomed, while their male colleagues benefit from a double standard. The article states, male colleagues were to be found with lank and dirty hair, dandruff on their collars, stained ties, unsure about the precise positioning of their trouser waistbands over or under their paunch, and their suits looking as if they had doubled as sleeping bags. If a woman were to appear in a similar state, she would make front-page news that day, and questions would be asked about whether she was fit to be a member of Parliament. Historian Eleanor Herman points out the society's double standard results in female leaders spending hours getting ready, while men can just shower, shave, put on a suit, and be ready to go. Hillary Clinton told the authors of the book Women and Leadership that in the presidential election, if you conservatively say I spent an hour a day for hair and makeup, that's an hour that a male candidate didn't have to spend. And it added up to 24 full days. It's absurd. 24 days out of my campaign were present getting ready to go campaign. A man gets in the shower, shakes his head, puts on a suit, which is pretty much the same as everybody wears, and goes out of the door. So it does breed a certain amount of resentment where you are like, wait a minute, what am I doing? It's time-consuming and exhausting. For her senior thesis at the University of South Carolina, Skylar McLean tried to pinpoint how much gender played a role in the 2016 presidential election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. She concludes that while the impact of gender on a national, multifactorial occurrence such as an election is impossible to quantify, it is possible to detect patterns. In American politics, the oppositional gender binary allowed the initial disenfranchisement of women, relegating women to the domestic sphere and excluding them from direct political participation. The political structures, as such, were created with non-minority men in mind. the men who comprise the political elite of the time. As gender roles are no longer legally restrictive, more women have attempted to move into the public sphere. Unfortunately, they are often thwarted by remaining societal and structural barriers erected in an earlier era. Women's representation continues to lag as a result. Following the 2016 presidential election, the office of the president remains a bastion of masculinity. The office is the highest and most highly gendered in the nation. The position's unique blend of functionality and symbolism allows traditional gender norms to dictate the presidential image. The presidency is most often characterized as a male role, with a woman existing in a support function, akin to a traditional Western concept of gender roles. The historical narrative again impacts the conceptualization of the office, due to the uninterrupted string of male presidents. This is due to the nature of politics, which have been in American culture assigned masculine traits. Having to pinpoint the perfect balance between traits disadvantaged Clinton's campaign against Trump because she could not articulate a unified message. Many times, she found herself caught between the concepts of competency and authenticity in a manner her opponent did not experience. Trump was free to project all masculinity all the time. On the other hand, the Clinton campaign was obliged to consider the nuances of tone and dress to a much larger extent, lest she come off as too masculine or too feminine. Her embrace of motherhood allowed her to more adequately balance her perceived masculine quantities with feminine ones. Hillary Clinton's campaign did not result in winning her the presidency, and her gender-related disadvantage contributed significantly to her defeat. Of course, a number of other factors were certainly at play. A fear of terrorism in America and across the globe had a profound impact on a large section of voters. As previously stated, female candidates are not considered capable of dealing with the threat of terrorism in the same way that male candidates are capable. With several high-profile attacks in recent years and a challenger who called attention to the potential dangers of unrestrained immigration, terrorism, and national security likely occupied a fair amount of issue-based voter recall. Matilda would have faced the exact same concerns in her era, as the role of king had long been defined utilizing masculine terms. The king was expected to bravely run into battle, yet chivalry demanded that women remain safely away from the battlefield. The king was only beneath God in authority, but a wife was also beneath the authority of her husband. Every other king would have been expected to sire a number of bastards throughout the lands, but a woman was expected to be demure and free of all scandal. But the single greatest handicap that female leaders face is pregnancy. In the modern world, the disadvantage is best highlighted by sports, as male professional athletes regularly fly to their wife's bedside and then hop on another plane to make it in time for their game, receiving a huge amount of accolades for being both father and dedicated to their job. CNBC highlighted the double standard in a profile on tennis superstar Serena Williams, one of the world's greatest athletes, regardless of gender. The news organization quoted Williams stating that, "I have never liked the word retirement. Maybe the best word to describe what I'm up to is evolution. I'm here to tell you that I'm evolving away from tennis towards other things that are important to me." Williams cited her family as the main reason why she will step away from the sport, writing that her 4-year-old daughter Olympia wants to be a big sister. The desire to expand her family, however, wouldn't be a career-ending move if she were a man, Williams points out. "Believe me, I never wanted to have to choose between tennis and a family," she stated. "I don't think it's fair. If I were a guy, I wouldn't be writing this because I'd be out there playing and winning while my wife was doing the physical labor of expanding our family." Matilda's bedridden state during her third pregnancy became a significant issue when the aging king fell ill during a hunt. Chronicler Henry of Huntington attributes the illness to Henry disregarding the advice of his doctors and consuming a dish of eels, a traditional Norman delicacy. 5 days into his battle with his own stomach, the king realized he was dying and ordered the church to administer the sacrament of the last rites. Still, other historians, including Elizabeth Norton, propagated the belief that Matilda, who was far from the king at the moment, somehow bore responsibility for the monarch's sudden death. Norton quotes Henry of Huntington's lesser-known belief that in the 35th year, King Henry stayed on in Normandy. Several times he planned to return to England, but he did not do so, being detained by his daughter on account of various disputes, which arose on a number of issues between the king and the Count of Anjou, due to the machinations of none other than the king's daughter. The king was provoked by these irritations to anger and bitter ill feeling, which was said by some to have been the origin of the chill in his bowels and later the cause of his death. Scholars who take this approach overlook the fact that the king lingered so long in Normandy largely because he enjoyed spending time with his 2 grandsons, the male heirs he had desired so badly for himself after the White Ship disaster. Matilda's bedridden state prevented her from traveling the 200 miles to be at her father's bedside, which in turn allowed some chroniclers to claim that while dying, Henry renounced Matilda as his heir and freed all nobles of their prior pledge to support her. However, there is nothing in any of the king's actions that lends weight to this blatant falsehood. Handley suggests that news of the king's condition would have taken a week to reach her, and by then her father had succumbed to the illness after fighting for 5 days. Matilda would have been a mess of emotions, fearing for her own safety due to complications from her pregnancy, sadness at the loss of her father, and elation at her achievement of succeeding her father as the ruler of England. But that assumed that the nobles of England would keep their oaths that had been made under duress to a king that they feared, a king that was now gone. As we conclude this episode, let's hearken back to the first of this series to remind ourselves that ascension to the throne of England was more than just a right. It was a race. That's how Matilda's father had achieved the throne. He had been the first of the brothers to be crowned, stealing the position from his elder siblings. While Matilda lay confined to her bed for the rest of her pregnancy, another race for the throne had begun without her knowledge, and the first to the finish line was her cousin, Stephen of Blois. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowry@gmail.com. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.